my message is not that developers shouldn't worry about the cloud. It's basically that developers should have the right tools to use the cloud, right? Like in Wing, we actually have this, in order to import a library in Wing, you use the bring statement. And almost by accident, eventually the first sentence you write in every Wing program is bring cloud, because you're bringing the cloud library into your code and you're using types from that library, right? And I feel like that's kind of like the message, right? I want to bring the cloud into my code base. I want to use it as a developer, not use it as an IT engineer, right? Like that's a different type of medium, right? Expression medium. Okay, so let's play.
Sure.
I have a few of those. Okay, so I'm gonna kick off Visual Studio Code.
Okay.
And we have an IDE extension for Visual Studio Code, so that's like table stakes. You can't have a programming language without IDE support. It's still, disclaimer, right? Like Wing is still in alpha.
Yeah.
Open sourced it not long ago, and we're still developing. So it's a great time to help shape it, and it's already starting to show some signs of life, which is really exciting. And we're in a really cool stage of the project. So on the terminal, I'm just going to run wing it, and that's a funny little thing, and it will basically open what we call the Wing console, which is a desktop application that's that you install on your machine, and it's kind of like your sidekick for building Wing applications, right?
Great.
So now, as I said, we're going to start with bring cloud, right? So now I've brought the cloud library, and if I do new, you can see that I have a bunch of resources that are part of the Wing standard library.
Okay.
And those resources are actually agnostic to the cloud deployment, the eventual deployment. They have names that are very similar to the AWS names, or to the kind of common cloud names like bucket and queue and function, but they're cloud buckets, right? Like they're not S3 bucket.
Okay.
And so they're an abstraction layer, right? And so let's start by creating a bucket, which is, I guess, the most fundamental resource. It's AWS's first service, so I should probably start with that, right? And you see that as soon as I saved my file, I didn't have to compile it in the background. I didn't have to run some multiple scripts connecting to each other in some weird way. The console basically picked up this change, compiled my code, and also showed me the bucket here. And I can interact with it, so I can upload files and download files and do stuff with it at this point, not too much. But bucket is not that interesting because it's not doing anything interesting. Let's create a function, right? A cloud function. So a cloud function, when you compile to AWS, a cloud function becomes a Lambda function, right? As an example. And the parameter that the cloud function accepts is what we call an in-flight closure. So it looks like a closure, right? Like a block of code, but it has the in-flight modifier. And that modifier is, in a sense, is all of the news about Wing is here in this modifier, right? It's basically the idea that Wing supports both infrastructure and application code together in the same programming language. And so the infrastructure is everything that happens here, right? Like the new bucket is basically infrastructure. I want to create a bucket. I want to define a bucket in my cloud application. And my runtime code is the stuff that runs inside my in-flight closures, right? And so in this case, if I do hello world and I save this, now I have my little cloud function here, and I can run it, and I see hello world, right? Now, this looks like a toy almost, but the thing is, when I compile this to AWS, so I can compile it and I can specify which target I want. I can do Terraform AWS, Terraform Azure, Terraform GCP, AWS CDK. So it can actually be deployed through CloudFormation and not through Terraform. You'll see that the target now includes a bunch of resources. This is a Terraform file, and you see that it includes my IAM roles, it includes my Lambda function here, it includes my S3 bucket here, right? Like, so it basically translated my application model into the specific infrastructure for AWS.
Got it.
And so when it's running here in my simulator, it's all running locally on my machine. So I get this like really instant feedback. But now let's see the most interesting part, right? I'm gonna put the bucket inside a variable. And let's say I want to put a file in the bucket. So I'm doing b dot, and then I see the API of the bucket, right? Like put, get, list, whatever, all these things. But if I do b dot here, I see a different API. So this is basically what we call the pre-flight API of the object. And this is the in-flight API of the object. And that's a really important fundamental. Again, it's related to this in-flight, pre-flight idea that each object has a pre-flight interface and an in-flight interface. And when you're creating classes, when you're declaring classes in Wing, you can also specify the in-flight API of the class and the pre-flight API of the class. So your custom types, they also have these two interfaces. And so I think like it's starting to make sense, like what you can build with these things, right? Let's put a file in the bucket, okay? Hello world, okay? So now, as soon as I save this, you'll see that the compiler not only updated here automatically, but also sees the relationship between my function and the bucket. Yeah, and so this relationship is not only a relationship, it's also qualified by the fact that I've done a put operation. And so when I'm actually compiling this to AWS, you'll see that the IAM policy has only put object permissions on the specific bucket. Because again, we didn't have tools that had the full picture to that point, right? And so having this full picture is the power of Wing, and it's the power of this tool as well, right? Like the ability to show these relationships. Let's see another small example. I promise it's not going to be too long.
Sure.
I'm going to do another third-party library for Redis, right? Like Redis is actually a really common thing to use in cloud development. And so now I'm going to do redis.redis, and I'm going to save that too. And now I have like a little Redis here. And I'm going to also call the API here, set hello world, right?
Okay.
And see that as soon as I did this, now I have like another error that shows that the cloud function is interacting with Redis. So it's not only for the core resources, like any relationship that exists, is the compiler understands it. And now if I call this function, I can basically see that now, I have my bucket here. And I also have like, if I click on Redis, you see that I get a command line interface for Redis, right? Because this is like a really useful way to interact with Redis. And I can see the contents of the key. And if this is compiled to AWS, it'll provision an Elastic Cache cluster and a VPC, and it'll put the Lambdas inside the VPC and make sure all of this is like wired up together with the right permissions out of the box, basically. But there's something really interesting about the fact the Wing is built on top of CDK technologies like JSII. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but basically Wing can use any CDK construct as a first-class citizen. And so you could technically bring any CDK construct from like any Terraform provider. Let's say you have a Terraform provider for GitHub, right? For GitHub repositories. Then you can actually load the GitHub repository Terraform provider into your Wing code and use it as a first-class citizen. So you can basically do, I don't have that ready as an example, but you can basically do new GitHub repository.
Oh.
And as soon as you do this, it'll plug in the GitHub repository resource into your Terraform output. And you can actually, reference it from your in-flight code with Terraform attributes. Like it'll take care of like the wiring of the attributes. And so to your question, even today, there is nothing you can't build with Wing in the sense of like which infrastructure you can use, which resources you can use, which cloud providers you can use, because the fundamental technology is basically just synthesizing Terraform configurations, right, or CloudFormation configurations. And so you can use all of the Terraform ecosystem out of the box. I think the power is, creating these abstractions and these local experiences and all of that. But for now, we have there's nothing that blocks you from using any tool that exists today in the cloud.